In today's video, we're going to begin our in-depth exploration of musical intervals. Intervals are the way we measure and speak about the distance between two different pitches, and we've already encountered a few, like the octave and the half step. Over the course of this video and the next one, we're going to expand our knowledge to include every possible interval that you can encounter as a performer. Intervals are one of the oldest and most fundamental aspects of musical systems across the globe. Intervals are what take us from thinking about pitches in isolation to hearing them in the context of one another. And intervals give rise to harmony and melody, which along with rhythm, form the foundation of our understanding of music. To begin our study of intervals, we're going to imagine what it was like when intervals were first discovered. So hop in the DeLorean and let's take a quick trip to ancient Greece about 550 BCE. If you've ever been asked to figure out the length of one side of a triangle, then you're probably familiar with a Greek by the name of Pythagoras. As a philosopher, astrologer, mathematician, and musician, not to mention probably a vegetarian, Pythagoras was convinced that numbers wove the very fabric of nature, and that through the study of mathematical relationships, we as humans could reveal the very mechanisms underpinning the universe. It shouldn't come as too much surprise then to learn that a numerology stan like Pythagoras was most likely the first person to discover and describe musical intervals, at least in scientific detail. Since, as we'll soon discover, intervals are actually a measure of the ratio between two pitches and their frequencies. So, numbers. Now, there's an old story that Pythagoras, while sitting one day within earshot of the local blacksmiths, took notice for the first time of the hammers banging against the anvils. He noticed that when certain hammers rang out at the same time, they formed harmonies that were pure and pleasing to the ear. Yet while others formed clashing sounds that didn't resolve. So as the legend goes, Pythagoras rushed over to the blacksmiths, weighed each of the hammers, and then found that the hammers related by simple ratios like 2 to 1 or 3 to 2 were responsible for the beautiful consonances he had earlier heard. Now, unfortunately, that story is totally bogus, and the whole hammer weight idea is demonstrably false. In fact, a lot of what we know about Pythagoras and his teachings are sort of shrouded in myth and legend at this point. However, the idea at the core of the story turns out to be true, and Pythagoras' discovery of harmony did come about through the study of ratios and number relationships. It just involved strings and rulers, not hammers and anvils. See, Pythagoras was the one who discovered that a string, exactly half the length of another string, will produce a pitch that is exactly twice the frequency of the longer string. He also discovered that when you pluck these two strings simultaneously, together they form this consonant harmony. It's pure and pleasing to the ear, and today we call it an octave. His experiments extended to strings the length of a third, fourth, and a fifth of the longer string, and so when he plucked these different lengths together, they revealed yet other new and amazing sounds. It was these experiments that gave rise to specific intervals and changed the world's comprehension of music altogether. Let's return now to the present day to see how intervals are studied and discussed in music now. Although we'll come back to Pythagoras and his ratios in a little while. Let's begin with the two ways that intervals present themselves. Now, intervals can be either harmonic or melodic. Harmonic intervals are when two pitches sound out simultaneously. And melodic intervals are when two pitches are played one after another. In some sense, you can think of harmonic intervals as having a vertical identity, And melodic intervals have a horizontal one, at least in the sense of hearing pitch over time. Now next, let's lay out our nomenclature that we use to label these intervals. Every single interval is given a special name that's made up of two parts. First, the quality, and then the size. Now we're going to start with size because it's a little bit easier to understand. The size of an interval tells us how far apart these two pitches will be on the staff. And determining the size of an interval is as simple as counting lines and spaces. The interval sizes that we'll introduce today are seconds, thirds, fourths, fifths, sixths, sevenths, unisons, and octaves. Now, let's analyze a few different intervals for size alone to see how this is going to work. Here, we have C to F. Our goal here is just counting the lines and spaces that it takes to go from the bottom note to the top. It's important to note that we have included both the starting and ending notes in our count. So, beginning with C, we have a space, then a line, then a space, and then a line, where we arrive at F. We counted 4 lines and spaces, including our outer positions, so here we have an interval of a fourth. Take another example, D to B. We begin again by counting the space that D occupies, and then going up line, space, line, space, line, until we arrive at B as we count our 6th line or space. So here we have an interval size of a 6th. Now you may have already pieced together that the lines and spaces are just a visual representation of the musical alphabet, which means that we don't even need to see the staff to count interval sizes. Just using our pitch letter names, we can discern the interval size. For example, examine the interval formed from A to F. Remembering to count our starting note, we go A, B, C, D, E, F. And as we get to F, we count our 6th letter name. And so therefore, this interval is a 6th. And here's the kicker with interval size. Accidentals, they don't make the slightest difference when we're counting these sizes. Think about it. Accidentals don't change the position of the note on the staff, do they? Accidentals affect the pitch, but the note head is in the same location. So what we're measuring here, the distance between notes on the staff, won't be affected by any accidentals that we apply to either of these notes. Now, size is a really nice way to begin interval study because it's straightforward like that. Counting interval sizes is pretty easy, so long as you remember to include the beginning and ending notes, and the terminology is intuitive too. The only terms that take a little study to remember are octaves and unisons, notes that are either 8 letters apart or the same letter, respectively. Now, I imagine some of you are also realizing why interval size doesn't tell the whole picture. Consider these 3 intervals: C to G, C to G flat, and C to G sharp. Now, each of them is a distinctly different interval and sounds nothing alike to the others. But since accidentals don't affect our counting of interval sizes at all, each of these 3 intervals are fifths. Now, this is where interval quality comes into the picture. Quality is going to differentiate between each of these various fifths. We use terms like perfect, major, minor, augmented, and diminished to describe the quality of an interval. And we use half steps to help us determine which quality we'll assign to an interval. Here's how. Take one of our fifths from just a moment ago. C to G will work nicely. Our goal here is to count how many half steps we must travel to go from one pitch to the next. Now, having a musical keyboard here is really handy, since each key will serve as a visual representation for each half step. So, beginning on C, we place our finger on the keyboard, and every time we move our finger to the next adjacent key, we'll count one half step. By the time we move our finger to land on G, we will count our seventh half step. If we examine the other fifths from earlier, C to G flat and C to G sharp, we see that they have either 6 or 8 half steps separating their notes. So that means that we can use the number of half steps to help distinguish between intervals of the same size. In this instance, the fifth with 7 half steps, that's C to G natural, is called a perfect fifth. And the others are called augmented fifth and diminished fifth, terms which we'll define in the next video. For now, this is enough to demonstrate that while the musical alphabet can help us determine the interval size, we still need to count half steps within to determine the interval quality, and both parts are necessary to labeling the interval correctly. There's one more thing I want to call out before we go on. When we counted half steps to determine the quality, we placed our finger on the keyboard and counted one as we moved our finger to the very next key. But when we counted lines and spaces, or letter names, to determine the size, we included the first note in our count. Now, this is the one aspect of this entire unit that I think is a little tricky, and it can be easy to confuse. So make sure to keep these two straight in your studies. From here on out, we're going to be defining every interval within the span of an octave, and we'll introduce them grouped by their qualities. So let's begin with the perfect intervals, like the one we just used a moment ago. In that case, our two notes, C and G, are a fifth apart, and that fifth contains 7 half steps. So we called it a perfect fifth. You can hear it played now. Whenever two notes are a fourth apart, and that fourth contains 5 half steps, then we call that a perfect fourth. An example would be from C to F, and you can hear that now. The only other two intervals to be called perfect are the perfect unison and the perfect octave. Now, the meaning of those names by now may seem self-evident, but let's just put them in terms of size and quality. A perfect unison is when two pitches are on the same line or staff, and they are separated by no half steps. Now, an example is C to C at the same frequency. It's hard to play a perfect unison on the piano since it's no different than just playing one note by itself. But imagine, if you will, a flute and a clarinet, whose separate melodies both join together on the final note on the same pitch. Now, you'll hear each separate note due to the instruments and the melodic context, but they form a perfect unison between them on this final note. A perfect octave is when two pitches are 8 lines or spaces apart, and they're separated by 12 half steps. An example would be C to C above that, and this is what it sounds like. So that's it, the complete family of perfect intervals. It's only fourths, fifths, unisons, and octaves, and only as long as they have the appropriate number of half steps that we just laid out. Throughout this unit, As we learn about each group of intervals, we're going to add them to a chart so that we can keep all of this information organized. Let's put up our perfect intervals now. Up on the screen, we see a table with 4 columns, from left to right: quality, size, abbreviation, and half steps. And you can see our first set of intervals taking their place on the chart. For the shorthand, we abbreviate the word perfect to a capital P, and we use a number for the interval size. There's one more thing I want to show you before we take our break today. You might be wondering what's so special about these intervals to earn them the label perfect. Well, it all comes back to our boy Pythagoras and his strings cut to exact ratios. When he cut a string in half and placed it under the same tension as the longer string, he was doubling the frequency of the pitch it produced, and that special 2-to-1 ratio gave us the octave. Well, let's pull up this intervals chart and supply the ratios for the other perfect intervals. We just said the octave is 2-to-1, and before that we have the perfect unison at 1-to-1. As it turns out, the perfect fifth is a ratio of 3-to-2, and the perfect fourth is a ratio of 4-to-3. By the nature of these very small numbers, these ratios are deemed simpler and purer, and that's reflected in their sound. Now, these intervals are stable, secure, and consonant. We won't label all of the intervals with ratios, and I don't think it's something you really need to memorize, but I do think it's fascinating to see how the numbers underpin our perception of music. On a meta level, it does seem possible that all of these numbers might have something to do with the way that music possesses a universal nature. You know, the way it makes it so enduring across time and across civilizations. All right, so at the risk of wandering off on some sort of philosophical tangent, let's just drop the curtain on the first half of today's video there. In our discussion of intervals so far, we've learned that they can appear as either harmonic or melodic intervals, that we name them using both size and quality, and then we've started building a super handy chart of intervals by introducing the perfect intervals. Now, just like every week, you can hit pause in the next screen to get some water and grab some orange slices, and then when you're ready, we got more knowledge for you after the break. As we go on, we're going to introduce a couple of strategies that make it easier for us to hear and read each of these new intervals. Now, when trying to imagine the distance between 2 notes on the page, it helps to tonicize the first note. That's just a fancy term for treating the first note like do or scale degree 1. You know, tonic. Now, you've already done this to an extent earlier when we were counting the size of each interval. When we counted out lines and spaces, or letters of the alphabet, we started with 1 and counted until we reached our note. Well, isn't that what scale degrees look like? I mean, didn't we just treat the first note like scale degree 1? Do? That's tonicization. We just made the first note tonic to our ears, and we should totally keep doing that, because thanks to Maria and the Von Trapps, we've all got a pretty good memory of how a major scale should sound using solfege syllables. In fact, through our sight singing, we've been developing a pretty good understanding of where each of the solfege syllables lie in relation to one another. Let's take our perfect intervals and see how the solfege plays out when we apply this technique of tonicization. We'll use C4, middle C, just like earlier, as our first note for each of the intervals. And from earlier, we have a perfect unison, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, and perfect octave. Now, laying them out on the staff, let's just see what sort of solfege syllables apply if we make C do. Nothing really special happens at unison and octave. Those are both C, so they're both do. But at the perfect fourth and perfect fifth, well, the perfect fourth ends up being do to fa. The perfect fifth turns out to be do to sol. Remember, all of this is coming into focus before us only because we tonicized the first note of the interval. We treated it like do. Now, step back for a second from these perfect intervals, and what do you see? To me, it looks like the notes before us are halfway to making a major scale. So I wonder what would happen if we supplied the missing notes, re, mi, la, and ti, and then we were to measure the interval formed from do to each of those new notes. Well, that question brings us to the last section of today's video. To wrap up, we're going to learn one more quality type today, the major intervals. So pull up the staff we were just working on with our perfect intervals and half of a major scale. We're going to add the missing notes of the scale, like I just said, and then take a look at the intervals between do and each new note. That means we add D for re, E for mi, A for la, and B for ti, thereby completing our major scale. Cool. Now we can easily count scale degrees and determine the size of each interval. C to D is a second, C to E is a third, C to A is a sixth, and C to B is a seventh. But as we know, we need a quality. And what quality will we use to define these intervals? As it turns out, each of these are major intervals. And that's made easier for us to memorize because they're the naturally occurring intervals in the major scale. So let's look at each one individually, and then at the end, let's add them to our chart. We start with C to D, or in solfege, do to re. And using the piano keyboard to count the half steps, we can determine that this second contains 2 half steps. So therefore, we call it a major second. Take a listen to one now. Next, we have C to E, or do to mi. And this third contains 4 half steps. So we call this a major third. Hear one now. Our fourth and fifth are already covered in the perfect intervals. So our next new interval for us to measure is formed from C to A, or do to la. This sixth contains 9 half steps, and we'll call it a major sixth. Go ahead and hear this one. And finally, we have the interval formed from C to B, or do to ti, and the seventh formed here contains 11 half steps. That's just 1 step shy of the complete octave. We give this interval the name major seventh. Take a listen now. Now, taken together, these 4 new intervals are the complete set of major intervals that we're going to study. Let's add them to the chart we began earlier, which shows their quality, sizes, abbreviations, and contained half steps. A capital letter M is used to abbreviate major, and just like before, we use numbers to show seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths. All right, folks, that's it. That's a wrap on today's video. We covered a huge amount of material, so I want to say thank you for watching all the way to the end. We started with a quick trip back to ancient Greece, and then we learned that intervals appear as either harmonic or melodic. We learned to refer to them with a name that uses 2 parts, quality and size, and we also learned how to count each of these. And then we spent the rest of the video looking at each of the perfect intervals and then the major intervals, which together made up the entire major scale. So in the next video, we're going to pick up right where we left off today. And by the end of that video, we'll learn about the remaining 3 qualities of intervals, as well as fill out the rest of our handy-dandy intervals chart that we started today. So until next time, please be kind to each other, and thanks for watching.